wanted to thank thank you, you just all received notification. And I wanted to share, my gratitude to our panelists, Dr. Pamela Robinson, Jackie Liu, and Sophie Nitoslawski for joining us. All of them have either authored research briefs, or in the case of Jackie, worked on the issue of infrastructure and sustainability that we're going to be speaking about today. And before I pass the mic to my co-moderator, Dr. Robinson, I'd like to briefly provide some context and introduce a series alongside Open North's work. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Megan. So about Open North, if you're not familiar with us, Open North is a nonprofit based out of Montreal, working across sectors in Canada, Turtle Island, and globally to foster effective, responsible and collaborative use of data and technology and try to address complex problems. And before I move on, I just want to think about this a little bit and acknowledge where I'm sitting and the picture that you see beside me, which is the land that I'm on. Some of the problems that we think about at Open North are about new technology and systems. Like, how do we ensure that we protect data that's captured by new tools, such as sensors in forests? Other problems are rooted in older systems, such as settler colonialism. I am currently located on the treaty land and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which has been cared for by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples. The impacts of colonialism are still present on Turtle Island today, and in fact, we think about data and technology and how they've been instruments of colonialism for many years. And I would encourage you all to engage with and learn from approaches such as Indigenous data governance and the First Nations principles of ownership, control, access, and possession. And that's a concept trademarked by the First Nations Information Governance Center. And hopefully, we can all think about the risks of data and technology for the communities that our work engages with as well. And I want to, use that as the foundation for introducing the work that we do at Open North and this series in particular. And just talk about, if you go to the next slide, the Open Smart City concept which is noted here as an Open Smart Community that Open North defined in 2018, nearly 3 years ago. Because as the concept of smart cities was becoming more popular, we recognized that city stakeholders and decision makers were faced with options that were largely top-down, often privatized, and put solutions before problems, and that risks the public interest. And so we carried out research with Dr. Tracy Lorio of Carleton University and came up with the first definition for an open smart city, which is one where all stakeholders collaborate to mobilize data, if and when warranted, in ways that are ethical, accountable, transparent, thinking about the city as a livable commons, and trying to balance economic development, social responsibility, and environmental responsibility. This is really work that we have been pushing forward through the Community Solutions Network and operationalizing over the last few years. Sorry, if we could just ensure that all participants are muted, that would be great. So we've been operationalizing this approach through the Community Solutions Network, and that's a program of Future Cities Canada led by Evergreen and Open North as a lead technical partner funded by Infrastructure Canada. And our goal is to help communities of all sizes help explore smart city approaches. And we do this by, this is on the next slide now, we do this by sharing information, building knowledge and capacity, creating networks. Open North also leads an advisory service that provides access to leading experts and over 20 courses in English and French. And you can see that. Next slide, please, Megan. You can see the different steps that communities that are participating in our service go through. We really try to tailor, the support that we provide per community, and we're working with over a dozen communities across Canada, small, medium, large, rural, remote, as well as urban. And just as a note, the advisory service is accompanied by access to our learning management system. And right now, for a limited time, that learning management system is open, so you can sign up at lms.opennorth.ca. We'll place a link to it in the chat. And now then, finally, moving to the research briefs today and talking about this series that we're organizing. We published a number of research briefs, and we realized that there were a number of cross-cutting themes that we'd like to talk about. This webinar today is the first opportunity to do that, and we invited experts to talk about the themes. When we think about smart cities, we usually think about data technology, but of course they impact lived issues such as food security, violence in smart homes, mobility. And these are the kinds of issues that we're going to be discussing over these webinars. They're going to be happening every 2 weeks on Wednesdays at noon. So thank you for joining us today. And today we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Pamela Robinson, Professor and Director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning of X University, otherwise known as Ryerson University. I'll pass the mic now to Pamela to kick off the panel discussion.
Thank you, Nabil, and thank you to everyone at Open North and to everyone who joined us for your lunch hour today. It's really nice to meet you, and thank you for coming. A quick note on the institution in which I work. I'm not sure how much everyone across the country is following what's happening at the university that we will refer to as X University, but the person after whom our university is named is one of the principal architects of the residential school system in Canada, and our university has been having an ongoing conversation with Indigenous colleagues and Indigenous community members about the name of our university. With the recent news that 215 children's bodies were found in Kamloops, it's revived the conversation about the name of the university. And if you want to learn more, we have a standing strong task force co-led by an Indigenous elder, Joanne Dallaire at Ryerson or X University, that is providing recommendations about what we'll do moving forward. It's important to share, I think, in this context of sustainability and infrastructure, because how we name things and what we do with the physical assets we have speak a lot to intention and values. And so it's an important piece of context. Okay, next slide. Enough about the place I work. I'm super excited to introduce the panelists for this session today. We have two people who are joining us who've written really incredible research briefs that I strongly encourage you to read. The first person I'm going to introduce is Jackie Liu. Jacqueline helps organize and build new nervous systems that use technology and data. Jackie is now the data lead at the Mozilla Foundation, and she's developing a new data strategy to help them enhance their impact and to glean insights on global progress that relates to trustworthy AI. She was previously the director of digital integration at Sidewalk Labs, where she led the public realm pilot projects and also efforts to incorporate digital innovation into urban development by integrating physical, digital, and operational systems. She was also, in addition to this work, the inaugural director of data analytics at New York City Parks, and she founded their data science team, sparking the agency's shift towards more data-formed operations. She spearheaded their largest participatory street tree mapping project in the United States, and that resulted in a new digital platform that has a collaborative management focus on the New York City urban forest. It also allowed the public and members of the community to learn new things about open data sets in the city of New York. So we're super excited to have Jackie with us. I also want to welcome Sophie Nitoslawski. Sophie is in the process of completing a doctorate, an epic task at the University of British Columbia in urban forestry. She's originally from Montreal, and her first foray into forest research involved measuring trees in mittens and snowshoes in the dead of winter. So it's good hardy research. With a lifelong passion for trees that's followed her throughout her career. Her research and her professional interests include urban biodiversity, green infrastructure planning, urban technology, municipal sustainability, and resilience. Sophie's interested in how smart cities and urban technologies can shape urban forestry and green space management, and she contributes to a number of urban forestry courses at UBC and is a member of the International Society of Arboriculture Science and the Research Committee. So that's our panel for today. What's going to happen is the three of us are each going to speak briefly to the research papers that we helped draft. We're not going to recap them for you because we're going to try to tease them with the goal that you'll go and read them and engage. And then we're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves about some areas of resonance and friction between our work. And then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. So if you've got questions, the team at Open North will direct you, but you're going to put them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Okay, so let's go. The first two briefs that we're going to talk about are ones that I contributed to. And the first one focuses on something called the state of good repair. And in this brief, what I looked at is an infrastructure benchmark that Canadian municipalities and other North American municipalities use when they're trying to figure out what to do with infrastructure investments. And so state of good repair thinking determines how municipalities can spend their money to keep their infrastructure in a state of good working repair. So it has a maintenance function in municipalities, and it drives millions and millions of dollars in municipal governments across Canada to find their way into fixing things like bus networks or parks infrastructure. So it's an important thing that we're all experiencing in our everyday lives as residents of communities, but maybe not something that's on everyone's radar. As a planner, I've seen state of good repair budgeting working for a long time, but my own research looks at who's planning the Canadian smart city. And so I began to be interested in this tension between maintenance and innovation. People get press coverage when we cut ribbons and put shovels in grounds and write big reports and talk about the new things that are going to happen. And it begs this question about how do we balance both maintenance and infrastructure with physical infrastructure, but also new digital infrastructure. And so the brief that I wrote about the state of good repair and maintenance and innovation starts to explore these kinds of things. The interesting thing about these briefs are we wrote them in 2020 and they were released in 2021. And so there's always that funny tension around what did I say last year and how does it still hold true now in a rapidly evolving municipal environment? I think the two key things that are still relevant about that paper, even though it's still pretty fresh, are things that we should be thinking about. Are the first one is maintenance is really important both for digital and physical infrastructure projects, and we need to think about a culture of maintenance as we move forward with digital work. I don't know about you, but we have this bucket, an IKEA plastic bucket, full of old bits and pieces from former technology. When we're going to get rid of it, I don't know. It's like the digital equivalent of the junk drawer in your kitchen. If you look on utility poles around municipalities, or maybe even in the backyard in which you live, there are probably legacy old wires that are up there since time immemorial that serve no function, but no one's taken responsibility for it. If we think about the arrival of new digital technology, it's really important to think about who's going to look after it and who's going to remove it when it's over, among other things. And so moving ahead and looking beyond the pandemic, I think as we start to think about how do we build back better with significant infrastructure investments, looking at how the state of good repair thinking applies to both digital and physical infrastructure is going to be an important thing moving forward. Okay, next slide. This one is the bridge to the next two speakers. And this research brief was co-authored with a former graduate student in our program, Danielle Lenarczyk-Biss, who is now a planner in Toronto, and myself. And this research paper focused on looking at the Canadian Smart Cities Challenge Round 1, which completed in 2019, and how the people who applied to the Smart Cities Challenge imagined the deployment of technology in public spaces. And so it was an interesting survey of the kinds of things that people were thinking about. This work was evolving at the same time as the Sidewalk Labs group was focusing on the Quayside project, and their Master Innovation Development Plan also included a number of technologies that had uses in the public realm. And Jackie's an expert on that, so I won't take up her space. But it's interesting to think about what happens when we place digital technology in the public realm. Because data has so much value, its arrival in public spaces can create tensions, including a really big question around whether or not space truly remains public and civic if it becomes a space for data collection. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be collecting data in public spaces or in civic spaces, but it means that we need to think carefully about what we're doing. We need to be transparent and we need to tread carefully because our civic spaces, our commons, are amongst our most valuable resources that we have available. One of the things that this paper looks at is the work that planners and designers have to do. There's a tremendous gap between technologists and the planners and the designers and the shapers of public spaces. And so people on my side of the house have a lot of work to do in terms of learning about how new digital technologies have impacts in these spaces. And we really need to pay very careful attention moving forward as we think about the arrival of innovative technology, what it means in terms of keeping these spaces public and intended for their ultimate civic good. In terms of questions that we've learned thinking ahead from COVID, I think what we've seen across Canadian communities is that this pandemic has really shown us how vitally important our public spaces are to the lifeblood and the sustainability of our communities. These spaces have been pushed and taxed in ways that we didn't imagine. We're seeing so many more people needing so many more things from limited physical spaces. what we want to make sure moving forward is that any decisions that we make around technology support their civic, open, and inclusive use, and don't create any barriers to the appreciation, enjoyment, and necessity of these spaces put to public good. Okay, so those are those two briefs in brief. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to Sophie, and Sophie's going to talk about her brief. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. It's wonderful to be here. And to contextualize my brief before I get into it, and feel free to move to the next slide, Megan. I do want to emphasize the fact that this has been kind of a collaborative effort, in the sense that this brief is the product of a bunch of research that I've participated in as a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, as part of a research group that has used some grant funding from SSHRC to look at horizon scanning techniques for looking at how digital technologies are being increasingly applied in forest ecosystem management, including urban forestry and urban natural asset management. I'm also part of a research group on the University of British Columbia campus that is piloting innovative kind of software and hardware-based technologies for monitoring natural assets on campus. And importantly, I would also like to acknowledge that this research is taking place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So this is, I guess, all this to say is that this brief is kind of a bit of a culmination of this work. And it's come at a really interesting time, I think, especially, you know, post or even during COVID, as we recognize that urban green spaces and natural assets provide incredibly critical services to urban dwellers. And we are approaching a lot of our work around climate resilience and climate response. And so we know that there's now a lot of recognition, potentially increasing recognition, that urban green infrastructure, and when I use the word green infrastructure or natural assets, I really refer to assets that have some natural elements, whether designed or engineered, or perhaps not even at all. There's a full spectrum of what green infrastructure can really encompass here, from a tree in a backyard to a rain garden to a green roof. But there is recognition that these services are, or these assets are multifunctional and provide a whole suite of benefits to urban dwellers. And alongside this, we're also seeing that, you know, in the smart cities discourse, there's a lot of data that's being created. There's a lot of data that's being collected in various ways as we participate, or as cities kind of deliver municipal services. And there is kind of increasing interest in understanding how some of this data might potentially help practitioners and municipal managers manage urban natural assets. And so I approach this very much from an urban forestry perspective. I worked as a forester for the city of Montreal for a couple of years. And a lot of the work that we do in urban forestry is often very laborious. It's often very resource intensive. And unfortunately, we often lack the resources to really do the kind of planning and maintenance work that is needed to grow healthy and thriving urban forests. And so a lot of the work that we do, myself and also as part of the research group, is to try and understand how a smart cities approach, so using kind of data and connected technologies, could enhance the delivery of municipal services, or the benefits that trees and urban forests provide, while also getting at these questions of how can we do things a little bit more efficiently? How can we get at better data for informing management and decision making when we're dealing with dynamic and changing ecosystems and dynamic and living beings? And feel free to move on to the next slide, Megan. So I touch on some of this in the research brief, and some key takeaways here are that there are still lots of opportunities to integrate smart city concepts and tools and technologies in natural asset management planning. Natural asset management itself is in its infancy in Canada. So there is this growing recognition among municipalities that natural assets provide a lot of benefits that are sometimes difficult to value, to understand, and kind of put a dollar value on sometimes when it really comes down to budget requirements. And so there is potentially an opportunity to explore how we can use data and connected technologies to help the natural asset management and planning process along. So that could include inventorying natural assets. It could also include monitoring natural assets, valuing them, and figuring out how to fully integrate them into infrastructure systems, and how we understand how we can better manage and maintain these systems. And as I touch on a little bit in this brief, I also encourage practitioners, as they kind of start to explore the space, to think about how, not just how a tool or a technology could be just thrown into an urban forest site or a park and we can get at data on trees, but also how we can start to explore maybe dual functions to these technologies. So how they could maybe enable better citizen stewardship opportunities, or collaboration opportunities with community groups, private sector as well. So there could be potentially some multifunctionality here. And I kind of enjoy that approach because it gets at also the multifunctionality of natural assets and green infrastructure. And in terms of what I've learned since I wrote the brief, I feel like every day that passes is kind of like a week or a month or a year. And I feel like there's so much that I could say to this, but something that is definitely coming up as a gap in this space is that there's a need for more kind of social sciences based research at the intersection of natural assets, urban forestry, and smart cities. So it's still a little bit unclear what the barriers look like. So for urban forest managers, for natural asset practitioners, in terms of not just procuring technology, but also using technology, adopting it, maintaining a technology, and how can we deal with maintenance of digital assets alongside natural assets, where both are have their challenges, and it can be quite difficult to kind of reconcile or figure out how we might allocate certain resources to these assets, especially when it comes to maintenance. As Pamela so rightly said, tree planting is the sexiest thing, but pruning and watering and making sure that those trees provide the services that we want them to into maturity is actually really difficult. It requires a lot of resources. And so how can we perhaps use data and connected technology to enable that process? And finally, there's definitely a need for a bit more of a whole systems approach when it comes to addressing key issues. And we've seen that in urban forestry. We're seeing increasingly that there are issues around equity. So just a really simple example of that is the distribution of tree canopy across the city. We know that there are some neighborhoods that are underserved. We know that there are historically marginalized communities. And so how can we ensure that the application and even just the process of applying a tool or a technology in these ecosystems does not exacerbate these types of issues? How can we ensure that it's not just a question of planting a whole bunch of trees and making sure that they grow and that they provide services in these underserved neighborhoods, but how can we ensure that the process by which we are using technology and the way that technology is perhaps mediating our relationship with trees and natural assets, how can we ensure that this is not exacerbating existing issues? This is a really big concern. We want to make sure that we can fully address these questions in a whole systems way and really consider the social, ecological, and technological relationships that exist in urban landscapes. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A period, but for now, I'll pass it over to Jackie.
Hi, amazing. Thanks, Pamela and Sophie, for sharing your research briefs. I feel really lucky right now, actually, to have an opportunity to kind of pull a lot of the threads that you all highlighted into a kind of real live project. So next slide, please. So I'm excited to kind of share the story of a project I worked on while I was at the Parks Department in New York City, which is the story of the 2015 street tree census. Now, New York City had a long tradition, first established in 1995, of working with members of the public to better understand their street tree population. And each decadal census had actually catalyzed advances for urban forest management in New York City, from establishing a block pruning maintenance program, so same way we resurface city streets, we put the trees on a block pruning cycle, to calculating the return on investment of the city's trees. And for the 2015 census, the vision was not just to get a new data set to justify more funding, although that was obviously important because we need to make sure that our trees are healthy. The goal was actually to completely rewire how urban forest management works in the city and to build a new nervous system for how New York City manages its street trees. Next slide, please. So we had a really challenging dual mandate to work with. We were asked to engage the public at scale, so building on this tradition of volunteer-based data collection, but also collect asset management quality geospatial data. So it had to be good enough for foresters to use every day. And the fundamental problem was that there wasn't really an address for a tree, but that's how data has always been collected in cities. Data is tied to the block and lot, and that is just how things work because of the legacy of property records and property rights. But unfortunately, that made the data unusable for most people. When you turn the data into a map, the map didn't reflect what you actually saw as you walked down the street. Next slide, please. So luckily for parks, there was a small civic tech group called TreeKit that had actually developed a prototype which married a centuries-old technology, which is a measuring wheel, with geospatial technology that made it really easy to map street trees quickly and accurately. They were motivated by trying to figure out how to support other tree stewards like themselves and to measure the impact of their work. But they found the city's tree data unusable. They actually wanted to design a better way. And so over a period of, I'd say, about 4 years, we worked with them to iterate on it into something that could scale citywide for the 2015 street tree census. And we were inspired by open street mapping parties. And we built out a platform around it to hold tree mapping events across the city, and ultimately engaged more than 2,200 volunteers in 60 community groups to map more than 660,000 street trees. Next slide, please. And so once the data was collected, we flowed the data into a new asset management system where the data would be maintained. What we learned from the prior censuses was that if we didn't do that deliberately, the data itself would fall out of date and kind of not be as useful for ongoing maintenance work. And so in addition to doing that, we also prioritized putting the data back into the hands of the volunteers that created it. We built a public-facing portal that would allow tree stewards to use the data to guide and track their work. We also hoped that by exposing the data, we would help make sure that it was maintained by the city's foresters. We also held a hackathon to pair local tree stewardship groups with civic technologists that were interested in open data, and developed open data for all workshops to introduce data analysis to the tree census volunteers who helped us collect the data, but were actually new to data analysis. Next slide, please. And the end result was the shared data set that kind of lives on to this day. We'll share later the link for the street tree map. But basically what we see here is that the public and the municipality literally shares the same tree inventory to support their activities. The city uses the tree data to support maintenance, and the public uses the same data to learn about the urban forest and to track their stewardship efforts. And so literally through the use of digital technology, enabling a new type of collaboration. Next slide, please. So, you know, I think this work was important. Well, I mean, I spent a lot of my life on it, but, you know, I think it was really about trying to involve both the public and the municipality in the entire life cycle of using data for urban forest management, from the data collection to the maintenance to actually analyzing and using the data for insights. And I'd say a couple of key takeaways was that one, this initiative was only possible because parks released our, quote, poor quality tree data to the public, where the trees were nowhere representative of the map. And that was actually what inspired Liz and Phil to help us fix the problem, because they were like, well, the city needs help and we want to make this better. So I'd say all the municipalities out there that are worried about releasing imperfect data, do it. You never know what will happen. And then the second key takeaway is that we needed both internal and external champions to overcome sort of bureaucratic and administrative hurdles so that we could actually work with TreeKit and the other civic hackers and technologists that wanted to work on this issue. For an example is that even though we were successful in applying for a grant, we then had to learn how to help TreeKit incorporate and figure out how to actually give them the grant money and move through. So that was like a big learning. And I'd say since then, since this project, this was, you know, many years ago now, there's been increasing interest in sort of scholarship in collective forms of data governance. And I've kind of since then started to reframe this effort, which we'd always kind of thought of as like a massive citizen science project, is actually an early effort in that spirit of, you know, shared data collaboration and stewardship. So that is the kind of practitioner perspective I offer, and hopefully that gives people some good things to think about. So I turn things back to, I'm not sure, to Pamela, to Megan, to Pamela. Thank you.
Yeah, it's to me. Thanks. So many things we could talk about, and Baldwin has started putting questions in the chat. I'm going to encourage everyone else to do it. I've got 2 questions to get us going, and then we'll have space for questions from the chat. And the first kind of thread I want to pull on is this question of like, what does it mean to be open when we're thinking about infrastructure and sustainability? I think that there were really interesting things about new ways of working and new ways of doing. Maybe that's part of open, but Jackie and Sophie, I'd really love to hear from you about when you think about open in the context of sustainability infrastructure, particularly with technology, what does that mean to you? And like, what are some things that are worth thinking about?
Yeah, so thanks for your question. When I think about open, I do think about inspectability. I think there's like when people think about open, they're like, oh, it must be open source. It must be kind of like in the commons. And I'm not sure that that is while that is a great bar, I think there's like a minimum viable need for just things, systems, whatever they are, decisions, the data that's collected to be inspectable. And so I think that's really a thing to sort of strive for here. I think it was interesting when we first, there was a lot of debate in New York City at first when when the open data mandate in New York City, which is it's actually a city policy and a law, came up, and we were required to share a lot of our data. There was a lot of concerns about the data is not representative. We know it's not clean. There are sort of all of these issues here, and I think the one kind of takeaway that from this whole tree mapping idea, and actually in all of the other open data sets that I helped to release at Parks, is that perfection is not the goal. Is if you put the data out there, then you're actually that is the spark for that innovation. That there are problems that you've been struggling with as a municipality, and you just never know where the answer might come from. But if you don't give the broader public an opportunity to participate, and the first step is by making your decisions, your data, your systems inspectable. That is so yeah. Now I'm in rambling phase. I'm just gonna put it there.
Those are excellent points.
Okay.
I totally agree. No, and I love the idea of saying don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Sometimes it's enough to just throw out the data that you have and see what the reaction might be. And I maybe I'll try and push that idea a bit further. And I want to see if this will generate some controversy here. But sometimes when I think about openness, kind of moving beyond just the open data approach, I think about replicability in science. So the idea that when you're doing science and we're, let's say, trying to publish a paper, here's like the academic and be my PhD is like in the back of my mind all the time. We are expected to be able to justify our decisions and provide evidence and showcase gaps in the research and highlight why we do what we do and how we do it. And so I think that when it comes to openness in cities, it's also important to not necessarily, have kind of an element of openness when it comes to data, but also the process by which that data was collected. How is data collected and why? What is the quality of that data? And that's important because
so important.
we know that data is not objective. It's not like ones and zeros. Data is often collected for a very specific reason by specific people. And there may be agendas involved. And so I think it's very important to recognize that it's not just about the output. It's not just about like, here's the data and it's open. It's like, okay, but what's the context here? Like, what's the background? And what does that mean?
It's super important, I think, Sophie, to think about, so in the earliest days, we used to think about like open is like, it's up, like it's a box that you check off, right? But the process piece of open, I think, is one moving forward that's really fundamental. Like open, you have to be open to a chance to give other people an opportunity to help or contribute. You need to be open to the idea that the wisdom or the missing expertise is outside the people who are sitting at the table. You need to be open to answering the question, what's missing from this data set, or who's not at the table, and how do we create conditions in which they might want to come and join us, right? And we also need to create, I think, this space for people to be open to learning, right? Research I did on civic hackathons like a gazillion years ago, we talked to municipal staff about what did they get out of civic hackathons. And we were thinking first, like, oh, is this a new form of procurement? Is it a form of hacking? Really what it was just a different way for city staff to sit around a table with keen and interested people from the community to try to solve problems together. That was the number one benefit municipal staff kept coming back to over and over and over again, was they were open to new ways of working and new ways of thinking and new ways of doing. And so I think this little circle around the openness piece is so important in the concept of smart cities. And for the people who've come to join us, if you haven't looked at Open North's work around open smart cities, I'd really encourage you to take a look, because Open North has put a deliberate wrap around digital technology in community spaces to try to have it extend benefits beyond what we normally see, but also to ask us to think critically about what that openness really requires. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question and we're going to open it up. You know, when you think about the work that you've done where the digital meets the physical, what are some of the most surprising things that have happened? Because like when you think about technology in the abstract, it's easy to think about all the good and the bad things that can come with it, right? Like that, it's all speculative, but it's really abstract. But like, you know, Jackie, you said like street trees don't have an address. That's like a really real material thing, right? When you try to engage community members in keeping their community urban forest stronger, Sophie, we learn real things, especially when we start to gather them through technology tools. So where the digital meets the physical, can you reflect a little bit on some interesting things you've observed or things that we could take away moving forward in these efforts to bring technology to public spaces or the public realm?
I could definitely start, Jackie, if you want some more time to
Go for
think about
it.
it. I see you thinking
Am I
on your
looking
screen
like I'm
there.
thinking? Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Thinking face.
And I don't know if this necessarily gets at your question, but I'm going to answer it in the context of this project that I'm involved in at the University of British Columbia campus, where the part of the context of the project is actually trying to leverage the 5G network to monitor urban trees, which is like this high speed network or whatever. And that's not really what the important thing is here. But what's fascinating about trying to kind of bring together trees and natural assets, vegetation, and kind of digital assets or data collection is that trees are kind of slow growing and vegetation kind of just sits there. It doesn't seem as dynamic as data seems, but I think that there's a nuance to get at here where it's just that trees and vegetation, natural assets, don't change very fast to our eyes. But I think that there's actually some really interesting interplays here with data and connected technologies and starting to gather data on natural assets where we can get at some of these kind of higher frequency changes that are a little bit more difficult to get at in kind of more traditional urban forest management practices where you just think of like planting and then pruning and then watering and just making sure that it grows. You know, trees react to stresses all the time. It's just that it's often very difficult to get at, you know, what these reactions look like. And there's a certain, you know, professional and personal interest for me in using some of these technologies to get at kind of some of this more high frequency data that has been difficult to get at in the past. And so the interplay of kind of having to figure out how to use kind of more dynamic data smart systems, let's say, on what seem to be kind of less dynamic, maybe more static, slower systems is really interesting. And there are lots of kind of questions that it's unearthing there. Fun.
Oh man, I kind of want to fall down a different rabbit hole in response to
Go
Oh,
ahead.
let's do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
that question. It's like we spent so much time in New York City trying to like use like infrared and sort of different remote sensing techniques and other communication tools. But I did want to kind of go back to kind of Pamela's like original question a little bit. And I think when I reflect on the digital, where the digital now meets the physical realm, I think about how it's just really, really different from our everyday and kind of like how people think of digital technology, where in particular, when we use digital technologies as an individual, the trade-off is really clear. The benefit is really clear. Okay, I'm going to download the Starbucks app and I'm giving you my email address and my credit card, and it means I am going to probably get a free coffee. And at least there's a clear rubric that's being presented to you. We can critique whether we think the consent is really meaningful or if they're fully transparent, but there is a very kind of clear moment where that rubric is kind of presented to you. It's like, if you do this, then you will get, or you have the potential to get XYZ benefits. And then I think about the digital and the physical, especially in the context of public spaces. I think the onus is on all of us to really talk about and get really crisp on what that benefit actually is, especially since the benefit doesn't accrue to the individual. When I download something on my phone, it's all about me. It's about what I'm doing. It's about, you know, the data that's about me. When we're talking about sharing data or having data collection in public spaces. That is the hope is that, or I think a way a lot of these technologies work is that the benefit is not direct to you as to the individual, but it's to a community level or to a group level. And so I think about like the challenges related in, one, how do we make that clear to people so that they even understand sort of what is happening? And then thinking about the challenges of being able to communicate clearly and be able to show the results of that data collection. Like, it's like what is the benefit? What is the decision system that we hope this data collection might drive, whether it's actually an AI system or it's a city council meeting or whatever? The data is intended to drive a decision. And so I think that is something that has to really be sort of upfront. And I think one of the challenges is that unfortunately digital has kind of like escaped, the cat is kind of out of the bag, it is all around us already, and we haven't made kind of systematic strides towards actually kind of digging into these issues and communicating them clearly. So I think that's really what I think about a lot outside of trees and sustainability and infrastructure.
So before we pass it over to Nabil, I'll just just add to this that, one of the things that I've seen from my vantage point as a planner watching digital arrive in physical places is that we keep feeling like we have to invent all these new systems of governing things. And we actually have some ones that are a bit road tested that could be extended further. And I'll use environmental assessment as a really simple example. Environmental assessment is an evidence-based process that's intended to help us think about the impact of something new in a real place. And so we could bring that forward and start using a similar process around thinking through what happens when this technology comes. And Jackie, to the points that you were making, like one of the things we all have to get comfortable with is separating out our individual experience from what it means for the collective. Sophie, maybe when you teach research methods, I love to talk about the ecological fallacy, when people take their own experience and scale it up to the entire population. And COVID doesn't help that, right? Everyone's very focused on their own individual experiences, but really learning who you are in a community of people and who you share experiences with, but also who may have different experiences from you that are really important, I think is a fundamental part, Jackie, of taking up the challenge that you talked about. And Sophie, building on the work that you do, who we are together, we have to be good together to be able to do this work as technology arrives in real places with real people. Okay, Nabil, there's lots of good stuff in the Q&A. So I'm gonna stop, pass it to you, and let's go.
Sure. Yeah, and as I'm transitioning, there's a number of questions that we received. I just wanted to connect this to our open smart city approach and what we reflected on as well. I won't take more than a minute, but I wanted to just, I think, echo and really appreciate the conversation you've all had. The conversation around, and I think we're really thinking about, the line between the virtual and physical infrastructure and worlds are increasingly meshed, they're increasingly blurred, I would say, not meshed. I'm thinking about, when COVID hit, there was a digital transition, thinking about your piece around maintenance, Pamela, governments were looking for COBOL developers. COBOL is a language that we used in the 1970s and 80s. And, it reminds us that actually our digital infrastructure is built on codes from decades ago. And I think, to echo something that Jackie was thinking about, was saying it's not just a divide about digital meets physical, it's also about the past meets the present meets the future. And I think, investing in maintenance and continuing to invest in what we built in the past is actually crucial to actually building a good future for everyone. And I think I have lots of thoughts, but what I'll note quickly is that, from an open smart city approach, these conversations about the commons are actually conversations about the future and how can we have them in the open, and it's not just a smart city isn't just one that sits in the IT department. It's actually something that touches planning, parks, economic development, community engagement. It touches every part of the community. And so, these are not just conversations that some people tend to have, they actually touch everyone's lives. and we can make strides. So far, we haven't made a lot of strides around that conversation on public infrastructure, but we can. But I'm going to actually now, so there's a number of questions in the chat. What I'll do is, I know I'll actually invite some people to unmute now, and I'll start with asking Baldwin, who's asked a number of questions in the chat. Do you want to unmute and pick which question you want to ask to our panelists? And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, not to pick on you, anyone else can go ahead and speak as well. Let me see if I can unmute you if you haven't already. There we go. I've asked to unmute.
Hi there. Okay. Yeah, I was trying to unmute myself, and I guess I couldn't by myself. I guess the first question I had was around the question of qualitative data. We know that we tend to collect what we know, and we tend to collect what is easy to collect. So we privilege the quantifiable and the measurable much more than we do the qualitative data. But we know that our daily lives are filled with qualitative data and experiences that are very difficult to measure. So I guess my question is, how do we bring that qualitative aspect into our decision-making process, into our models, so that we can account for those instead of using proxy data through the quantifiable to measure the qualitative? Thanks.
That's such a great question. I guess I could, sorry, Nabil, I just threw myself into the ring here. And then I'd love to hear from Pamela and Jackie. That's such a great question. And I think it kind of reflects a concern in the ecosystem services approach that is often used in kind of natural assets and urban forestry, where we have, this idea that trees and vegetation provide certain services that we can quantify and then often put a monetary value on, unfortunately. And one type of service known as cultural ecosystem services are often very much on the kind of, I guess, qualifiable side of things. And it can be much more difficult to kind of tangibly understand and value and monitor those types of services. And there have been some strides in that space to figure out, from an urban ecology perspective, cultural ecosystem services mapping. So how do people move through space and through surveys? And that's something that we're also exploring in our project at the University of British Columbia. But more broadly, in terms of how to kind of wrestle with this issue, I think that, and there have been some strides made in this space as well. I think that municipalities and those who are involved in project ownership and project management can be a bit creative in terms of key performance indicators. So instead of simply relying on KPIs that are very much grounded in quantity, so how many people did we reach today, and that kind of stuff, we can get at quality. We can get at key performance indicators that are very much on the other side of things. So how did folks react to this type of intervention? And that can be got at through surveys and through kind of more creative engagement processes. But I think that it requires a certain openness to move beyond traditional key performance indicators and get at ones that are perhaps a little bit more in the intangible space, so to speak, even though they're not really intangible at all. But I think there are ways of doing that, and it's a question of being a bit creative and out of the box. And I'm sure Jackie and Pamela have some more insight on that too.
Jackie, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think when I think about kind of qualitative data, I think about a lot of the stories that come from, the experience of actually working with people in their communities on some of these different issues. And I think, I think it was always a challenge, is, and especially in the Trees Count project, that was such a kind of collective active making, is what do we really sort of think about as, how do we capture that? And I would say that unfortunately at the time we were very sort of, kind of limited to the sorts of tools that we had, and kind of thinking about so we could, think about social media and encouraging people to sort of put their stories out there, so at least there would be some sort of narrative about this experience and this active making and collaboration. But yeah, I think that, some of the outcomes that we would have loved to been able to measure, but it was, you know, I think having a ready tool set that was kind of like easy to go was really tough. Even as a relatively well-resourced municipality, you know, how do you think about, you know, capturing these stories and archiving them? And then I think even just kind of like, where do they go? Whose stories are they? I think there's like a much bigger question than like how we can actually bring that together. So I think that if there was, you know, I think surveys are useful. They are, you know, very sort of intensive. I do think about like how some of the promise of digital technology now, while admittedly, you know, participation in avenues and media streams like social media are, you know, sort of like inherently limited and sort of like biased in their own right. Those sorts of like organic methods of people's lived of understanding and recording people's lived experience, I think could have a lot of potential if there were some of the underlying sort of access issues could be addressed. So that's kind of my 2 cents on this one.
And I'll just briefly jump in and add that I think we have to be really active about making and keeping the space for those kinds of ideas and feedback to find their way into public and civic processes. You know, one of the things that technology promises is a more efficient process. And we're seeing municipalities across Canada start to experiment with machine learning and natural language processing, for example, to process people's feedback to local government. You know, the planner in me is like, I think you need to put a sticker on that website that says a robot's going to read my input, right? Like, I think when people write to the city hall or their counselor, they think they're writing to a human. And I think we're entering into this time when we have more ways to reach out, but less capacity on the inside to receive things. And so if you're a person who keeps a public process inside a public institution, I think you need to actively think about, if you're offered up a tool that's efficient, at what cost does that efficiency come? And whose ideas and stories are being parsed out because of the technology that you're using? It isn't to say it's bad, but you really need to bring a yes and proposition to how you start to work with your members of the public. And so for some conversations that could work great, but in other ones you may really want to deliberately not use it or build other things so that that kind of participation and engagement can happen.
Everyone, and that's a reminder, like in advocacy, we say, don't email, call your counselor, call your member of parliament. You know, someone will talk to you then. I want to now invite Rashi Kilnani maybe to ask your question.
Yes, and there's been so much interesting stuff in the chat that I am struggling to find it there, and I will, as soon as I find it, I can ask it. But oh yeah, so I wanted to ask, first I wanted to thank all the panelists for enlightening discussion so far. And I wanted to ask about something that's really been on my mind, particularly with respect to COVID, which is how can we include people who are not participating with technology, either because they don't want to, like my mother, or because they simply can't afford to? And how can we ensure that these populations are represented in an open city framework?
I'd love to start on this one. I think that when we think about how digital technology comes into like our communities and our spaces, a lot of technologists quickly go to, you know, the phone and say, oh, this is how I can kind of bring this technology or this benefit or this new mode of interaction to someone, and really are not addressing the fundamental access issues in terms of who gets to have a phone, who gets to have a data plan. So you know, my personal and possibly slightly controversial stance on this is that I actually think more computing needs to be moved into the physical environment so that you can sort of decouple the ability to use and leverage these sorts of digital services and digital capabilities away from what you personally have access to and have. You know, I think, you know, I know in the case study or in the research brief, you know, Link NYC was brought up as an example, and there are a lot of challenges related to kind of like a first of its kind project there. But then you also have to think about like, well, what were some of the potential benefits of having moved some of that functionality into a space where people who otherwise might not have access to it at all could have it as well. So I guess that's just kind of my kind of quick take on that one. Oh, I'm not sure if Pamela or Sophie wants to follow.
Yeah, I can just quickly add in, this is such a challenging problem. And, you know, in the context of natural asset management and urban forestry, this is, you know, also a problem when it comes to data collection and kind of the social system and how people interact with trees, is that often we really only get at, you know, certain groups in a community. And sometimes there are absolutely gaps, especially when it comes to more marginalized or vulnerable communities. And so I'd love to explore the space a little bit more and kind of figure out exactly maybe whether like a mixed kind of methods or a mixed data collection approach might be really the way to go. But I think that the important thing would be to have a really good idea of potentially who is not being involved in the process, because it's kind of hard to try and, you know, target or get at certain groups without knowing who they are. And so that would be kind of an important part of that process. But my thinking is that, especially when it comes to trees, I mean, people, many different types of groups feel so strongly about trees. And so that's also potentially an opportunity to engage with people who might not necessarily engage with the tech, but they may engage with the tree side of things, which is kind of interesting.
I think the other thing that COVID has really just hit home, which is something we all knew before, but it's really added punctuation around it. If you think about the topic that I wrote about, which is the state of good repair, like what's the state of good maintenance in terms of civic culture in your community? The most important conversations we need to have are hard to do if you can't talk to each other about other things too. And so I think the ways in which we work together to figure out what are the things in our communities that need attention and how are we going to fix them, but also what are the futures we aspire for and how do we get there together? It's an ongoing conversation. It's not episodic. It's not a public meeting. An app's not going to fix it. We have to kind of get in the habit of talking to each other so that when big conversations come along, we're ready to do that. It's very hard to go from 0 to 100 in terms of civic engagement if you have no track record in history together. And so I think if you have those conversations going, the technology tools can really help, but they can't replace good work together that's ongoing and durable.
Thanks, Pamela. Just because in the interest of time and I want people to be able to leave at 1 o'clock, if Megan, you can share your screen, I just wanted to quickly just share that, you know, the advisory service is still accepting communities. You know, we're working with a number that you can see on the screen, and you can contact us, visit our website, opennote.ca. And I think there's also a poll that's going to appear right now, just a quick evaluation. So you can just quickly respond to it as you're online right now before you jump off. And then we're going to continue, you know, if panelists, Pamela, Jackie, and Sophie could stay on and want to take more questions, we're open to doing that. But I just wanted to share these announcements before people jump off because it is 1 o'clock and we want to respect people's time. And we're also going to be, and after, we're going to share an evaluation survey over email as well if you're not able to fill out the poll. So the poll is live. Please fill it out. Some of us have already started voting. And now we're back. And before I actually, also to wrap up, I wanted to say, Pamela, Sophie, and Jackie, this has been a really rich discussion. Lots of notes, lots of conversation in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great. So I think we can end recording and then we can actually continue with more Q&A if people want it.